Good morning and welcome, Deb Tribe in the Mornings Chair until this Friday. Well, first up this morning, we're going to talk about population. What is the right population for our nation and for our state? With big cities like Sydney and Melbourne groaning under the strain of rising populations, what should Adelaide be aiming for? Well, the Federal Minister for Cities, Urban Infrastructure and Population, Alan Tudge, is in the studio and he is going to tell us all about it and also about the document that he has signed this morning relating to South Australia, and because we began our nation's space industry way back when, in fact back in the 40s, but we were the third nation in the world to launch a satellite in 1967. Now we've won the national space race because it's been announced this morning by Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Premier Stephen Marshall that the Australian Space Agency will be based on North Terrace at Lot 14 at the old RA site. So we'll talk about the impact of this decision and I'd love to hear what you think about both of those issues. And then there's the one that we are surrounded by. Our devices. We're constantly connected. We've got our mobile phones, our tablets, our computers, our smart TVs. The list goes on and on. They often know more about us than our best friends. But the ACCC has warned that the lack of regulation of Google and Facebook means that our personal information, which is immense, is being provided to people, is being gathered. We don't even know what's in it and we have no control over it. So we'll talk about what needs to be done in relation to that. If you would like to join in any of these conversations, please call 1300 222 891 or you can text 0467 922 891. It's 6 minutes past 9. Well, Adelaide is an amazing place to live. We all think it's an easy city in which to live, but it's been estimated that in the next 30 years or so, our national population will increase by over 11 million people, with the majority occurring in 5 major cities, including Adelaide. But we all know that livability and sustainability are what makes a city a great place to live in, so they are essential in the planning. How do you increase population without creating difficulties for the people who live in the cities like us here in Adelaide? I'm pleased to welcome to the studio Federal Minister for Cities, Urban Infrastructure and Population, Alan Tudge. Thank you very much for coming into the studio. Now, you're not here for today's COAG meeting. You're actually about to fly out on a plane. What have you been here for? So
this morning I was here with the Prime Minister and the Premier, and we were announcing the fact that the Space Agency is going to be right here in Adelaide. And we're also signing the City Deal Memorandum of Understanding. And what that deal will do is an agreement between the two levels of government for the development of the Lot 14 precinct, the old hospital site.
I was down there watching it being demolished a few months back.
Right. So there's still some buildings which are coming down, and it's going to be just a brilliant precinct in the near future and a real hub for innovation, which is what the vision is. And through that, it'll be a job creator, it'll be a place for training, and we just hope it'll be a real stimulator of the economy for South Australia.
Quite unique to have a site of that size in the middle of a city.
It really is.
And on what is already a cultural boulevard.
It really is, with these beautiful buildings there which are being restored as well. And the Space Agency will be based there. There'll also be a new museum put there just right opposite the Botanical Gardens. And it's just a magnificent 7-hectare site. So the vision of that as an innovation and entrepreneur precinct, I think is fantastic. It'll end up being the best in the country when it's completed and a real stimulator for jobs of the future.
How much of that site is going to be devoted specifically to the Australian Space Agency?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. It'll just be one component of it. There's all number of other components, though, to the overall site. There's also going to be a new Indigenous museum art gallery built on the site as well, facing into the Botanical Gardens. So it is going to be a magnificent site, which won't just be for the Adelaide headquarters as such, Adelaide CBD. It will really make a difference for the whole of the state because it will foster innovation, and at the end of the day, innovation drives jobs growth and drives the economy.
Well, look, we are going to return to space in just a few moments with some of our space entrepreneurs already occupying sites in Adelaide to find out their reaction to having the announcement this morning. I'm sure it will be very positive.
It's such an exciting morning for Adelaide in terms of announcing that space agency. You know, it's a $41 million direct investment from the federal government into Adelaide. But more importantly, it really places Adelaide at the heart of space in Australia. And it already has a significant industry here, but it means it'll turbocharge that industry. And we hope that'll end up with thousands more jobs over the years ahead.
Well, look, I'd like to look at the issue of population now, if you wouldn't mind, Minister, because I'm a big visitor to Sydney and to Melbourne. Melbourne,
Yep.
I used to drive to often and found it really easy to navigate my way around. Not so much anymore. Very
exactly
difficult to
right.
do so. Adelaide is a relatively easy city to live in with its current population. That's one of the things that people that live here are most happy about. How much bigger do you want us to become?
Oh, the question is how you manage the growth. And I'm from Melbourne, and I know exactly what you're saying, because 10 years ago the roads used to move in Melbourne, and now they're very congested, and people are telling us that loudly and clearly. And so there's a lot of benefits for being a larger city like Melbourne, because you have more opportunities, particularly for young people. And so there's benefits of growing, but the question is how you manage that growth. And what we want to ensure is that as Adelaide grows and as South Australia grows, you have the infrastructure and the services and the housing approvals all aligned with that growth. And that's why we're bringing this concept to COAG today, because we control the major population growth lever at the federal level, being the migration lever. But the states and territories are largely responsible for the infrastructure, the services, the housing approvals, and we have to make sure they're aligned. And that's what the discussion today is about.
We have seen ad hoc developments occurring even here in Adelaide. Certainly, I'm sure you've had them in Melbourne, where you'll have a parcel of land that becomes available. A developer decides to put housing on it, but there isn't a forethought given to the roads in and out, to schools, to green spaces, all of the above. Is it about trying to get some synergy between the three layers of government so that there are aims that they are all working towards?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Certainly the most important thing at the macro level is for us to be able to match what are the major population levers, being migration, and migration drives 60% of the overall population growth, with the states and territories' forward plans for infrastructure, hospitals, schools and property approvals. And we need to make sure they're aligned. And in Sydney and Melbourne, part of the difficulties which we've had there is that the infrastructure hasn't kept pace with the population growth. Now, those cities have been growing very, very rapidly, and we actually want to just ease the pressure off those big cities. But South Australia, I mean, it has real opportunities to grow more and create more opportunities, particularly for young people, so they don't feel as if they have to go over east in order to get further advancement in their career.
If we just return to immigration for a moment, because that's a big issue for us here in South Australia, and decisions were taken about temporary visas, which had an impact on our regional South Australia. You've been quoted as saying, tell me if this is right or wrong, that 87% of skilled migrants go to Sydney and Melbourne. We've heard that that's not actually the case. It's closer to 57%. So what do you see happening to South Australia in terms of immigration, and how are you going to try and ensure that people do come to Adelaide and to South Australia?
Yeah, so this is what we're discussing, and I've had these discussions with Premier Marshall about this, as to how South Australia can, in essence, get its fair share. You've got to grow the economy to start with so that the job opportunities are here. And that's what things like the Space Agency are about, the shipbuilding investments, the defence investments and the like. And the economy is taking off in South Australia. But second, then we want to support the growth aspirations with migration, and in a strategic, in a targeted way to support the jobs which are being created. We can do that. There's some levers at our disposal to be able to assist in that effort, and we're going to be investigating those and working with the state government to implement it.
Okay, look, we've had a couple of calls in. And now Sam Dulac, Liberal member for Waite, is on the line. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Deb. Good morning, Minister, and good morning to your listeners.
Now, you chair an inquiry into the benefits of migration to South Australia. You've got the Federal Minister right here. What is it that you wanted to say?
Look, good morning, Minister, and great to have you back in Adelaide. And I think one of the important things that is coming through our inquiry that I'm chairing is one about appropriate planning, but it is about those federal levers around visas and priorities for South Australia. And I think something that everyone who's given evidence before our inquiry, all the AHAs and the leading business industry groups want to see South Australia have a special migration zone and status that can prioritise our need for skilled migrants, and just keen to get the Minister's view on that.
So the answer is yes, we do want to work on that. And even as part of the City Deal Memorandum of Understanding that the two leaders, Premier and Prime Minister, signed today, part of it was about the development of Lot 14 as an entrepreneurial centre. The second element was actually about putting in place better settings to grow the population, which might include things like special visas for South Australia or designated visas for particular areas where you need more people and have jobs which are available. We see this in a lot of regional areas, actually. In fact, the data shows that there's 46,000 job vacancies in the regions today in Australia.
And that's what our inquiry is finding as well. Areas such as Murray Bridge,
yep.
In the southeast through Narra Court, up Port Augusta and Port Perry Way. There's a need for a lot of skilled.
Absolutely, I've been hearing that feedback as well particularly from the abattoirs, particularly from some of the farmers who can't get workers to do the jobs.
We know there's a need, but how are we going to get those workers here?
So we're working on that. In fact, one of the tools at our disposal, which we can implement and we're working on, is what's called a designated area migration agreement, which is basically a boutique arrangement which you might make with a particular geographical area. We just did one, in fact, signed it earlier this week with Western Victoria. And they've got many of the same issues as parts of South Australia have. So there's a model there which we can utilise, and we're keen to explore that.
Thank you very much for the call. Look, if we can go to some of the texts that are coming through, and one issue that's been raised pretty much straight up is from Dave. With rainfall dropping, with global warming and successive governments developing prime agricultural land, forgive me, my screen's just refreshed, haven't we already reached a sustainable population?
I'm not sure what he means by the question in terms of a sustainable population. So is that person suggesting that we should not grow at all further? I'm
assuming that is what the question says.
Right. I mean, that's a couple of things. A, we're going to grow because people are still having babies and people are still getting older, and that's a good thing on both counts. So you have natural growth in any case, and that's about 40% of the overall population growth. And second, though, migration is absolutely critical for Australia. And it's critical in terms of filling skills shortages, which we don't have. It's critical, actually, in ensuring that we've always got a good working age population so that we don't age overall, because you very quickly find that if you're not immigrating younger people into the country, the overall population gets older, and then economically that puts the country in a very poor place, because you obviously have fewer workers generating tax to pay for the services you need in old age.
One of the big issues here in South Australia is water, of course. We're at the end of the Murray-Darling Basin system. Greg from North Haven has called through on that issue. Good morning, Greg.
Yes, good morning. Thanks, Minister. Yeah, I think the previous questioner was asking about the provision of sustainable quality fresh water for current and future generations in South Australia and throughout the whole of Australia. So when I hear about Infrastructure Australia sort of funding projects and stuff, it's often about roads, but in terms of quality fresh water for drinking and for agriculture, etc., plus in that context of climate change with evaporation and salinity, even for our underground aquifers, we have some big issues to address here, Minister.
Listen, in terms of the water challenges, absolutely, and that gets taken into account as well. So what we've asked the premiers and the chief ministers to do is to inform us from the ground up, if you like, as to what the population plans are for their respective states and territories, taking into account all of the infrastructure that they have presently and have planned to be built into the future. That might include water infrastructure. And then as much as possible, we can set our migration settings based on the aggregate of those plans. And that way we can get a much closer alignment between what the carrying capacity is of the nation versus what our migration settings might be at the national level.
There are obviously concerns in relation to population coming through on the text line. Ray echoes what was said by Greg in relation to water. Steve says, Sydney and Melbourne are vile, overcrowded, sprawling messes and are sobering examples of the end result of an economic system based on exponential growth. disappeared again. Let me find it. We need to think outside the square. We live in a finite space with finite resources. We can't grow forever. Is there a limit? Is there a limit? You're looking at 11 million people in the next 30 years, at least 250,000 people here in Adelaide in that time, or dwellings at least. Is there a limit to sustainability?
The question is, how do you manage your growth?
But is there a limit?
I think you've got to look forward at least sort of 10 or 20 years into the future, and that's what we want to do the forward planning for. And over the next 10 or 20 years, inevitably Australia is going to grow. It's going to grow on a natural basis in any case because people have babies. We're all getting older.
But is there a time that we should be worried, Minister? Is there a time that we say, actually, we are now encroaching into our arable land. We are now creating cities that are unlivable. We're going from the most livable cities in the world to the most unlivable. Is there a time? Is that time going to come?
Well, we still have, I think, 4 out of the top 10 most livable cities in the world. Melbourne, Sydney, and Adelaide's one of those, and Perth. And so we're a long way from having the least livable cities in the world. And as long as we plan our growth and we ensure that we've got the infrastructure, we've got the sustainability, we've got the water, we've got the schools, we've got the hospitals, we've got the housing approvals to match the growth, then I think we can get bigger. Well, and there are real advantages also to growing as well.
The planning is the issue. I can't read you everything I'm getting on the text line here, but it's talking about, for example, one of the areas that we've got here in Mount Barker, one of the fastest growing populations in Australia, very little thought put into it. And it comes back to the siloing, doesn't it, of decision making. We've got health, we've got transport, we've got all these different arms of government, we've got developers wanting to maximise their economic benefit from housing developments. How do you actually create a system whereby all of those things are put together to try and get the best outcome for the people living in the cities or living in the regional areas?
Yeah, I mean, I would say...
What say do they have, actually?
Listen, I would say overall in Australia, we do pretty well with our cities. I mean, the fact that we've got 4 of the top 10 most livable cities in the world, I think is testament to that. But second, a lot of those very localised planning decisions are obviously not made by the federal government, and we don't necessarily want the federal government intruding down at that very localised level. That has to be done by local councils and the state governments. Where the federal government needs to be involved, though, which is what we've been discussing and what's on the COAG agenda today, is in relation to the population growth rates for each of those particular regions and what actually is manageable. Because we at the federal level control the main lever, and that is migration, as I was indicating before. And how do we ensure that we've got the right population growth in the right parts of Australia? Can we ease the pressure slightly off Melbourne and Sydney? Can we grow in a strategic manner South Australia, which is the aspiration certainly of the South Australian government? And but you've got to have the planning in order to be able to cope with that.
Do you believe in climate change? That's a question on the text line.
Is that a question on the text line? The climate, of course, is changing, and human beings are making a contribution towards that.
Well, Minister, I don't know what time you have to leave, whether you can stay with us or not. Are you on a very tight time schedule to get to the airport?
I can keep going. We've got a few more questions.
Okay, it's 23 minutes past 9. With me is Alan Tudge, Federal Minister for Aston and Minister for Cities, Urban Infrastructure and Population. In just a moment, we're going to get the response from Michael Bayliss, Communications Manager of Sustainable Population Australia.
Sonia Feldhoff.
Got to say, going to Paris for the World Cup in patisserie, it's going to be a tough haul.
If we get close to the French, we'll be highly excited, and just to prove a point to everybody, there are some amazing pastry chefs in South Australia in particular also.
Weekday afternoons from 2.
The whole sex talk thing is difficult, I think, for any parent. Have you had that one yet with your kids, Vic?
Yeah. I just gave them a couple of keywords to type into Google and we just left them in their room.
On ABC Radio Adelaide.
You're listening to Deb Tribe
on ABC Radio Adelaide.
In the studio with me this morning is the Minister for Cities, Urban Infrastructure and Population, Alan Tudge. In just a moment we'll hear from Sustainable Population Australia, but Martin from Clarendon has called in on 1300 222 891. Good morning, Martin.
Oh, hello. Look, my concern is that migrants get old too, and then do we bring in more migrants? When does the Ponzi scheme end? This sounds very much to me like a PR piece for the growth lobbies who donate very, very heavily to to political parties. My concern is that we're going to keep growing and one day we'll wake up and say, good God, we've wrecked the place.
Thanks very much for the call, Martin. I have to say that's being echoed on the text line, Minister. For example, Deb from Warradale has just sent in a text saying, today's infill in suburbs, tomorrow's slums. No backyard, no trees, no garden, street trees cut down. My suburb is becoming a nightmare at the hands of developers building boxes. Do the people of Adelaide really want it to become another Sydney or Melbourne? So how are you going to overcome that fact? I mean, people are raising legitimate issues.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of appropriate development, I mean, those are decisions for your local councils and for the state governments. And you want to make sure you have good local planning, and you need to be involved in your local council elections and get involved in that process to ensure that you get that.
What are you asking the ministers at COAG to do today? Because doesn't there have to be a complete cooperation and synchronisation between the three tiers of government?
Well, that's exactly why we have put it on the COAG agenda as the number one item for discussion today. And as I said, we don't want to get involved in the sort of the micro planning. You know, the federal government doesn't want to be involved in determining what sort of housing developments you have in a particular suburb, but we do control the population growth lever, which is the migration growth lever.
But has anybody asked Australians what they want?
Oh, we're having a pretty rigorous discussion at the moment in relation to migration, in relation to population, in relation to planning. This discussion is going on around Australia at the moment. It always becomes an election issue as well, so it's inevitably discussed as part of election cycles. Now, I want to take up
who
this point.
Decides what makes a place a good place to live, though? Who makes that decision, and what evidence-based research is there on that?
I mean, we live in a democracy here, and we've got three levels of government, all of whom are accountable at election time. And we have a role at the federal level, and we're placing population planning more squarely on the federal agenda. Obviously, the state governments have a role, as do local councils. And so the people get a say at all three levels of government in relation to these things. Sometimes you have political parties who are running particularly on a slow down Australian growth, or more public transport, or no inappropriate development. I've seen political parties particularly on those matters. I just want to pick up though, and it was put and it wasn't answered. The caller before was saying, "Oh, we're just all part of the growth lobby. We've got money in our pockets." I mean, I find that offensive, to be honest, and particularly when the Prime Minister himself has actually said that the likely outcome of this process will be a slowdown in growth. So. Let's be clear about that. It will likely be a slowdown in the migration intake as a result of this process.
Okay, well, Minister, we're getting an urgent hand waving from your colleague. You've got to get on a plane and get out of here. But thank you so much for coming to the studio this morning. Greatly appreciated.
Pleasure, Deb. Thanks.
Thank you. The Minister for Cities, Urban Infrastructure and Population, Alan Tudge, joining us in the studio. It's 28 minutes past 9. Deb Tribe with you this morning. Let's now hear from Communications Manager of Sustainable Population Australia, Michael Bayliss. Michael, good morning.
Thank you very much for having me on, Deb. Good morning.
Good morning. Look, you've heard what Minister Alan Tudge has had to say about population growth. Do you agree it's realistic to increase Australia's population by 11 million people in the next 30 years?
I don't think that. It's interesting. A lot of people say it's not in the way that we grow, but it's in the way we plan. And we just need to be more innovative to cater for that growth. But I just want to posit a possibility. What if growing at the size of a Canberra, the equivalent size of a new Canberra every single year, is actually impossible to plan for?
Well, that's what we've just heard is on the agenda at COAG this morning for all of the ministers, is to plan better, but there are multiple problems, aren't there, related to planning, and I think we've just touched on quite a few of them. The fact that there are three tiers of government, the fact that within government there are silos on all of the different things that somebody wants to access, a school, a hospital, green space and the like. And also we know that development is moving faster than the planning that should be going before it. So how do we actually address these issues?
I think ultimately we need to slow down population growth until we can actually prove to ourselves that our infrastructure and our development is appropriate and can keep up, and that we can do that. The right we can't just keep growing infinitely on a finite continent and hope that all the tiers of layers of government will somehow at some point discuss and agree and offer us a magic bullet solution that we haven't yet come up with. Why don't we slow down the growth, have a stable population until we are at the point in which all layers of government can communicate, until we can prove ourselves that we can build sustainably and we can build appropriate infrastructure and development that is appropriate in a climate emergency. And only until we get that right do we go back to growing rapidly again. Now, I suspect that we won't get that right. And so really the most practical answer is to level off our population growth.
Well, we heard the Minister saying that the key lever in that is the issue of migration. Do you think that is the key issue in trying to resolve population growth and the tool to be used to slow it down?
Yeah, look, if our natural increase of fertility didn't change, and if our humanitarian program, our refugee intake, did not go down, we would still have a broadly sustainable population and growth rate. So it is the addition of economic migration, which is essentially growing for economic reasons to boost the GDP, that is the main driver of us growing by the rate of a new Canberra every year. And this growth benefits those that benefit from growth, such as the property industry, the construction industry, finance, big business, and it is obviously a disbenefit for the majority of Australians, as you're probably hearing from the feedback.
I am getting a lot of feedback on it, which we won't be able to get to it all, but I'd have to say a lot of it is supporting what you're saying. Michael Bayliss, we'll have to leave it there for the morning, but thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Deb.
Michael is Communications Manager of Sustainable Population Australia. So many of your texts. Carleen at Felixstowe says, our housing development is using valuable land that has been used for growing our food. Food sovereignty needs to be considered too. Karen says, big cities don't necessarily mean better quality of life and happy citizens. This beautiful land can't keep giving water, flora, fauna, etc. And Brad says, better start building nuclear power plants. We're going to need the power. Thanks very much for your text. In just a moment, we're going to move on to the issue of space, because it's been announced today we have the National Space Agency here. It's 27 minutes to 10.